Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Sudaso and I'm here with Ayavanda, and we're here to answer questions about Buddhism. So if you have questions about Buddhism, this is your opportunity to ask. You can type them into the comments window and there's a reasonable chance that we'll give an answer. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha and then we'll go through the questions. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Richard, Rick, Lydia, Young, Val, Cows Are Friends, Mary, Lily, Mike, Joseph, Monel, and many other people, some other people joining in.
See, Bhumika, Louisa, Meredith,
Maria.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, you can start going through the questions.
Mike as well. Okay, so good evening from Bolivia. Good night, good evening. And Richard says, there are 10 topics of frequent discussion: contentment, aloofness, seclusion, arousing energy, fewness of wishes, etc. Could you explain to me how to talk on fewness of wishes with others?
Yeah, so fewness of wishes is connected with contentment. So one way, of course, it depends on who you're talking to, and it depends on whether or not they're Buddhist, and it depends on whether or not they actually have any interest in spiritual practice and so on. So of course, you need to adjust the way you talk about these things depending on your audience. But ultimately, it comes down to praising the happiness of contentment versus the dissatisfaction, the discontent, the unease of being full of desire. So when you want a lot of things and you're wishing for a lot of things and you're hoping for a lot of things and you're craving a lot of things, then that means you're never happy. Whereas if you're content with nothing, if you don't want anything, then that means you're always happy. So that's a way of talking about fewness of wishes that many people, even many non-Buddhist people, might be able to understand.
Okay. And we have next question from Lily, who says, why do some people tend to control others or take pleasure in tasting the suffering of others?
Delusion, ultimately. Yeah, the delusion of self-centeredness. That's what it comes down to ultimately. Yeah, and then based on the delusion of self-centeredness, then that manifests in desire and aversion. Yep. Okay. Another easy question.
And it looks like Joseph has a question. It starts with "and," but let's see.
No, that's just a quote from the suttas.
Okay, maybe he's okay. Okay, maybe he's maybe it's.
So Joseph is quoting some lines from the suttas.
Okay, so he says, let's just read this. He says, this passage helped have deep appreciation and gratitude for all the times you encourage mindfulness of the body. Thank you for being compassionate.
Okay.
Okay. And next question then is from Lily as well, who asks, I've been dealing a lot with people from the Asura realm recently, and the whole experience has been incredibly painful. I truly don't understand why people from the Asura realm find joy in deceiving others. How are they shaped this way, and how should I deal with such deceivers?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as the Asura realm. If you look at the early Buddhist texts, the Asuras don't actually have a separate realm. They were, Asura is just a particular classification of devas from the Kama Loka. So technically speaking, there's no such thing as an Asura realm. But I assume by Asura realm, rather you mean people who have a strong tendency towards aversion towards envy is a trait that's commonly associated with the Asuras. Envy and hostility. Deceit is not a trait I would normally associate with the Asuras. That's more a quality that one associates with Maras. But yeah, I mean, so why do people with unwholesome tendencies do what they do? Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's delusion. It's because they don't recognize that by inflicting suffering on others, they're ultimately inflicting suffering on themselves. They're not reflecting on karma. It's not reflecting on the fact that through performing acts of bad karma, that they will experience harmful consequences in the future. Again, the world is full of delusional people. Actually, most of the people in the world are delusional. And some of them, their delusion manifests itself through hostile behaviors. And that's sad, but it's just the nature of the world. So right here at the monastery, we have this delightfully adorable and cute little cat named Teddy. So when he's inside the monastery, he's everyone's furry little friend. When he goes outside the monastery, he's a horrific, torturing murderer who slaughters the local squirrel population. So from one perspective, he's a delightful little deva. From another perspective, he's an absolutely awful asura. So what is he actually? He's just another delusional being caught in samsara like the rest of us. So this is just the nature of being a delusional being caught in samsara, is every now and then we tend to get stuck in a particular delusion cycle in which we think that hurting other people is acceptable or even praiseworthy. So that's just part of samsara, is that there are people going through that particular kind of delusion. So what you can do is to avoid them. If you can't avoid them completely, then minimize contact and minimize how much damage they can do to you, and cultivate compassion for them. Wish for them to be free of that delusion, which is causing them to harm others and harm themselves. Okay.
And we have another one from Lily. If someone claims to have attained Buddhahood and speaks the true Dharma, should we believe them and learn from them?
Absolutely not.
What about the Buddha?
Well, that's different because the Buddha is the Buddha. But if it's a contemporary teacher, like if you go to like arhant.com and it's like John Smith certified arhant teaching the true Dharma, that's absolute guarantee not to waste your time with that teacher. Even if a teacher says in private, like, oh, by the way, I'm a stream enterer, by the way, I'm a once returner, by the way, I'm a non-returner, be extremely skeptical, because 99% likely they aren't. 99% likely they're either delusional, that's the most likely case, or they're intentionally deceiving people. So most likely it's delusion. But every now and then you do get people who claim to have stages of awakening so that they can accumulate more fame. This is particularly problematic with lay teachers, by the way. Most of the time, if you encounter a lay teacher who claims to have some stage of awakening, absolutely not. Yeah, it's just no. No, it's usually either, again, delusion or occasionally people trying to accumulate fame and wealth. If you encounter monks who claim to be enlightened, that's a little more problematic, because we actually have very strict rules about, even if we genuinely believe that we're awakened, we're not allowed to tell it to lay people. So if you encounter a monastic who claims to have some stage of awakening, then it's probably that they have grossly overestimated their own attainments, and to the point where they think it's okay to break these rules about not reporting such attainments to lay people. So basically, anybody who tells you they're awakened, you can be almost absolutely certain that that is proof that they aren't. The people to watch for are not the ones who go around saying, I'm a stream enterer, I'm a once returner, I'm a non-returner, I'm an arhat. Those are not the people to watch for. In fact, those are the people to avoid. The people to watch for are the people who are incredibly humble, patient, kind, content, equanimous, serene, joyful. The kind of people who aren't bothered by anything. The kind of people who are always happy no matter what's going on. The kind of people who treat everyone they meet with dignity and respect. The kind of person who never acts like they're better than other people or worse than other people. When you meet someone like that, if you watch them over a long period of time and you never see them display any greed, hatred, or delusion, then you might assume that there's a chance that that person has some stage of awakening, and it might be right. And again, this will usually be a monastic, someone to have those kinds of qualities. But such a person will never openly declare it. So the Buddha is an exception. So he did what he did for very good reasons. But if you just meet an ordinary teacher who claims they're awakened these days, it's almost certainly not the case. Okay.
And then so there's a question. How should one develop patience? Is there a meditation to increase one's patience?
Yeah, sit for 5 hours straight every day without moving for a couple of weeks. You will develop patience because you will have literally no other option except to develop patience. Actually, meditation retreats in general are good for patience because you just, at some point you realize you just don't have any other option except to practice patience. So how do you develop patience? Long periods of meditation, long meditation retreats. Those are really helpful. Yeah. Okay, next.
Mm-hmm. And Monel says that I said something from last week's monk chat. Are we able to completely purify bad karma accrued in the current life? I'm trying to remember what specifically. I remember once talking about this and you had a question. But in terms of purifying karma, so the main teaching is that we can't actually purify karma. So although there are some teachings that talk about that in other Buddhist traditions, in the suttas and in most Buddhist traditions, it's pretty much universally understood that it can't be purified in the sense of removed. So it's kind of like what's been done has been done. It can't be undone because once it's been done, then the time moves on, right? So things move on and you can't go back and change that. So, but what you can do is you can change how it ripens. So you can change how it's to be affected. So this is what the Buddha says. He says that essentially that karma is not deterministic, which other religions would consider deterministic. Like, for example, Jainism. So in Jainism, karma is deterministic. So they believe that you create present karma, but the past karma is completely deterministic. And so in Buddhism, the teaching is that karma ripens according to the strength of the intention when it's created and factors that go into when it was created, but also the mind state when it is meant to be ripening. So it's kind of like if you plant the same seed in two different fields, and one you treat very well and the other one you treat really poorly. And so it's the exact same seed, but the fruit will grow differently. And so the same way, the phala, the vipaka, the fruit of the karma that we create, will grow. It'll sprout in a different way if our mind is cultivated differently. And ultimately, the best way to do that is if you attain arahantship, or if you attain Buddhahood, or if you attain full awakening, then you won't be the karma will only be able to ripen in your current life, in your last life, because past that there's no other point for it to ripen in. So that particular story would come to an end. But that doesn't mean it's purified, because actually arahants still do experience the fruits of their karma. They still experience karma. It's just that they experience a limited amount in a very minor way. And then the other major way that the Buddha talked about that is the Brahma Viharas, actually. There's actually several places where he said that someone who's cultivating the Brahma Viharas, so like metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, rejoicing, and upekkha, equanimity, if they develop it to a sufficient extent that their mind is actually limitlessly encompassing all beings with those qualities, then he said that their mind can't be restricted by any limited karma that they've done. So basically, if you actually have those to the level of a very high level, like basically if you have them to the level of jhana, and if you have it at a level that's assuming not just once, like you actually have mastery of that when you die, so when you pass away, or at least you've cultivated it really strongly, then the Buddha says that if the mind is at that level, then it can't actually receive the limited karma because it's so expansive. But that doesn't mean that you won't receive it later. It's just that, for example, you would immediately be reborn in probably the Brahma Loka because your mind would not be, it would be limitless. So it couldn't be limited by something small. But then after that karma is extinguished, like after the karma of the cultivating the Brahma Viharas goes down, if you don't have a stage of awakening, then you'll be reborn again. So it still wouldn't really be purifying it, but it's kind of like taking a road tour, a detour away for a little while. So yeah, it's still good, but the best thing to do is to cultivate your mind, to purify how the karma will ripen, and then ideally practice wisdom, because if you have insight, then you can actually start uprooting the, kind of cutting the time limit on when the karma can ripen.
Okay.
Okay, Yongchu says, I came across Ajahn Chah's The One Who Knows related article. I did not quite understand this. Could you please explain what it means?
I don't remember either. I mean, back at the beginning of my monastic life, I read all of the Ajahn Chah material, but that was a long time ago. Since then, I've been focused almost exclusively just on reading and rereading the suttas, because that's all you need, and it's very clear and precise. So I don't remember what Ajahn Chah said regarding the phrase "the one who knows." So maybe Yongchu, if you could talk a bit about whatever your interpretation of it was, or what you got from it, then we can talk about how that relates to the Dhamma. But I don't remember, and I'm not likely to track it down and read it.
Yeah, I know he often talked about like mindfulness in that way, but I don't know what this particular thing is. Okay. And then Lily says, regarding emotions, would you recommend deeply exploring the source of resentment and hatred? For example, examining early age experiences with the original family or understanding it through psychological perspectives. Would this approach be better than simply telling oneself to observe the emotions and let it go? Though the process might be more painful, but it will lead to a more thorough resolution of hatred in the long run? Question.
Well, I mean, ultimately, we are interested in results more than methods. So whatever method you're doing, the question is, what is the result? Is the result a reduction in unwholesome states, a reduction in unwholesome tendencies? Then that's good. If it's an increase in wholesome tendencies, then that's good. I've known a number of people over the years who spend a lot of time examining early age experiences, examining the source of their resentment and hatred, and the result is that they have even more resentment and hatred. And their self-identity built up around that resentment and hatred just became even more strongly solidified. So actually constantly ruminating about your traumatic childhood experiences is not necessarily going to fix anything. In fact, it might make things even worse. So could it improve things? It might. Could it make things worse? It might. So whatever you're doing, the important thing is to look at the results. So I personally recommend a more direct, present moment rooted approach, which is when resentment arises, recognize resentment as a harmful, unwholesome mind state, which was condemned by the Buddha, which brings suffering in the present moment, which creates the conditions for you to make bad choices, which will lead to even more suffering in the future. And regardless of what past story there might be to explain it, that past story is totally irrelevant because it's the past, and therefore nothing you can do about it. But what you can do in the present moment is to stop nourishing unwholesome tendencies of mind. You can choose to stop maintaining these harmful tendencies of mind. So it doesn't matter the past history of things. It doesn't matter the story behind the unwholesome action that you're currently doing in your mind. What matters is recognizing the unwholesome mental action as harmful and choosing to disengage from it, and cultivating a lot of loving kindness and compassion instead, so that it's less likely to come up in the first place. And if you do want to start thinking about memories of stories which you think might explain why you have resentment, I mean, that's all fine. Just keep in mind that those memories and stories are probably wrong. They're probably not particularly accurate. But if you do want to use those stories, then use them as a way of cultivating compassion. Compassion for the people who, out of their own confusion, did things that hurt you, so that then you can forgive them. Forgive them for the harmful things that they did. Recognize they're delusional, and in their delusional state, they made bad choices. How sad. May they be free of delusion. May they learn kindness and respect. And also for yourself, have compassion for yourself, recognizing your own suffering and wishing to be free of that suffering. So if you're using these stories in that way, then it's fine. But if you're using these stories as a way of building up your self-identity of, oh, I am the one who was traumatized as a child, well, then that's the opposite of Buddhism. Or if you're using it like, oh, yes, I definitely hate my parents because they did such awful things when I was young, well, that's definitely not Buddhism either. So you need to watch how you're using these stories. Are you actually using stories about the past in a way that is reducing your defilements, your delusion, your self-centeredness, or in a way that's increasing them? And the safest option is just not to use those stories because they're usually irrelevant anyway. Just look at your present moment experience. That's all the wisdom you need to recognize. In the present moment, perpetuating resentment just makes myself suffer. And it creates the tendencies to do even more bad things in the future. Whereas cultivating kindness and compassion and patience and tolerance in the present moment makes me happy and creates the conditions for me to make good karma in the future. Okay.
You say, Bhante, that the Buddha recollected 91 eons. So if you had to work through all that trauma, it would have been a long, long time.
Yeah.
So it's good news, actually.
That's the other thing is, like, when you think about how little of our past trauma we can actually remember, like, even if you could remember your entire life in absolute crystal clear detail, which would be awful, but even if you could, well, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to all the trauma you're carrying from past lives.
Yeah, so that can be actually support, because the Buddha actually did remember. You can just imagine all the things he did and received, and he didn't need to go through it one by one. So thank goodness. Okay, Mike Solis says, I know someone who has proclaimed himself an Ajahn on social media. He does not live with a Sangha, does not do alms round or keep the precepts. How do I handle him or spread the word to followers?
I recommend just don't be involved. So first off, the word Ajahn doesn't actually mean anything in particular. So Ajahn is just a Thai derivation of the word Acharya, which means teacher. And in Thailand, Ajahn is used as a title also for ordinary secular teachers. Like if you go to a university and your physics professor would be called Ajahn, an Ajahn of physics. So one doesn't need to be a monk to be called Ajahn. One doesn't need to be any particular level of attainment or anything to be called Ajahn. Just if you're in a role of teaching other people, then you're an Ajahn. So it's actually used as a very ordinary word in Thailand. So somebody calling themselves Ajahn doesn't actually mean anything. So let's see. So you have presumably a monk who doesn't live with a Sangha. Well, that's not a problem because we're not required to live with a Sangha. It's actually perfectly fine for a monk to live by themselves. There's innumerable examples of that in the suttas. Does not do alms round. Again, we're not required to do alms round. If people are bringing food to offer to us, then that's sufficient. Alms round is great. I love doing alms round, but if people are bringing food to offer, then we don't technically have to do it. As for keeping the precepts, so there are a handful of major rules which we have to follow in order to continue being monks. There's 4 to be exact. The rest of the rules, it's good for us to follow them, but they technically aren't required. And I say this as somebody who follows the Vinaya quite closely, by the way. So, and I would especially be very careful as a lay person judging the Vinaya practice of monks. So I've been a monk for a long time now, coming up on 20 years. In those 20 years, I have never met a single lay person who understood Vinaya. And even most of the monks I've met didn't really understand it very well. So Vinaya is an incredibly complex, complicated, and intricate system, which is not easy to understand without hundreds and hundreds of hours of study. And even then, you don't really understand it unless you're living it. So I would encourage you to be very cautious about getting into judging a monk's Vinaya practice. Unless they're doing really blatant things, like there was a case many years ago in Thailand of a monk who was taking the monastery credit card and going to brothels. That person is breaking some very serious rules. That's a problem. Not the credit card part, actually, it's the brothel part. That's the problem there. So if the monk is not celibate, then that's a problem. That actually means they're not a monk anymore, if we're being technical about it. They're not a bhikkhu anymore anyway. It could be some other kind of monk, but they're not a bhikkhu. So if they're not celibate, if they're stealing large quantities of money or very valuable things like stealing cars or something, if they're killing people like other humans, if they're murdering other humans, or interestingly enough, if they're claiming to be enlightened when they know they aren't. So those are the 4 things which we absolutely have to follow if we want to continue to be bhikkhus. So unless he's breaking one of those 4 things, then rather than get too caught up in trying to judge his Vinaya practice, instead look at his Dhamma practice. Is he cultivating kindness? Is he cultivating compassion? Is he cultivating equanimity? Is he cultivating wisdom? Does he study the suttas? Does he teach the suttas? Does he practice meditation? Does he teach meditation? Does he teach people to practice generosity and morality? So rather than judging the Vinaya practice, instead look at his Dhamma. Is he teaching Dhamma in line with what the Buddha taught? Is he practicing Dhamma in line with what the Buddha taught? That's actually much more important. And if, after having evaluated that, you have no faith in this monk, well, then just don't follow him. Don't waste time spreading the word to followers, because then you're creating the karma of spreading gossip. So again, unless it's something really harmful, like he's sexually abusing his followers or something, and even then, I would encourage caution. And don't spread rumors. Don't start circulating malicious gossip, especially if you're not 100% certain about the content of what you're spreading. And even then, be careful. It's really harmful karma. Those are my thoughts on it anyway. Okay.
And Sean says that he's interested, or they're interested in visiting the monastery for the first time and making it a regular practice. When would you recommend someone who's never been to come?
Just come to any of the public programs. And just come to the public programs, join in with whatever's going on. Come a few minutes early, and you can talk with some of the other people at the monastery before, stay a few minutes after, talk with some of the other people after. That's really how to start joining in the public programs.
Yeah, 5 p.m. on the weekends too is more casual talk time. So. Okay, and Kelser Friend says, I've been worrying a lot lately about bad things happening in the world. They're out of my direct control. Do you have advice for skillfully dealing with such worries?
Yeah, stop following the news. You can't do anything about all that stuff anyway. So, newsflash. The world is an awful place. It has always been an awful place. Odds are it will always be an awful place. And the world is not any worse now than it was 50 years ago. In fact, it's significantly better. The world is not any worse now than it was probably even 20 years ago. Might be a little bit worse in some ways. But overall, things are not dramatically worse now than they were in the past. The difference is that nowadays, the moment you pick up your phone, there's a million things of like, oh, Twitter, blah, 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 Facebook, blah, 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 and this celebrity did this, and that politician said that, and just don't let any of that infiltrate your mind. Cut every newsfeed out of your life. All that does is just stir up your mind with a lot of unwholesome tendencies. You can't do anything about it anyway. So instead, if you want to do something, look in your life and see what can you actually do to make the world a better place. Within your sphere of influence, what can you do? It might be something small, like volunteering at a local charity operation. But great, you're making the world a better place. Now you're actually doing something tangible and concrete to improve the world. But instead, if you're just spending all your time scrolling through awful news on Reddit or something, it's like, well, that's not going to help anybody. All it's going to do is make you miserable and agitated and disturbed. So I recommend stop following the news. It's futile anyway. And start looking for tangible ways to do good things for others and good things for your immediate society. Volunteer at charities, it's great. I used to do that when I was a layperson. Okay, next.
Okay, and Mary says something about keeping Teddy away from birds and raw food or milk. There's a new strain of H5N1 bird flu that is killing cats that eat wild birds and raw food. Uh-oh, oh well.
Well, hopefully the squirrels don't have bird flu.
Hopefully, Teddy's been not been going outside as much because of the cold. So, okay, thank you for the warning, Mary. And Sud says, "Dear Venables, I would like to develop my generosity, but materially in this life my means is limited. How should one best develop the paramita of generosity with limited material means?"
So generosity is not about the flat quantity that you give. It's actually about the state of mind of not withholding, the state of mind of non-stinginess. So, for example, if somebody has very limited means, maybe they only have $10 extra every month, and they choose to give that $10 to somebody or to a charitable organization, that is an incredible act of good karma. That's an incredibly powerful act. Whereas if somebody has $10 million and they make a big show of donating $10,000 a month, well, it's still an act of generosity, but realistically, it's not really noticeable to the person who's doing it. It's kind of like, oh, here, have a penny. It doesn't mean anything because it's just a tiny fraction of their actual wealth. So maybe you think, oh, I don't have a lot of material wealth. Well, that's not the important thing is. The important thing is, are you being generous with what you have? Instead of just withholding everything for yourself. So don't worry about how much or how little you have. Rather, cultivate the heart which is always looking for opportunities to be generous. Cultivate the mind which is always seeking ways to give and to help and to share. That's the important thing. Okay.
Okay. And then Lily says, "Why are the 3 factors for becoming a stream mentor, elimination, etc.? The 3 factors. Why are they prioritized before addressing greed, hatred, and ignorance? I thought that greed, hatred, and delusion are the basics."
Well, actually, in most places in the suttas, the Buddha does emphasize greed, hatred, and delusion. So that is the basics. That is the beginning, the middle, and the end of Buddhism. Like, this is every step on the path is the reduction and eventual elimination of greed, hatred, and delusion. So the 3 defining characteristics of a stream enterer are manifestations of that. Interestingly enough, all 3 of them are actually related to delusion. So the three aspects of the stream enterer, so Sakaya Deti is a form of Miccha Diti, of wrong view. Silabata Paramasa is a form of wrong view. And Vicikiccha is a manifestation of confusion, which is related to avidya. So again, ignorance. So all three of the obstacles which a stream enterer overcomes are manifestations of avidya or moha, so ignorance or delusion. Then the next two, which are what's overcome by a once returner and a non-returner, are in fact greed and hatred. So the three root defilements, greed, hatred, and delusion, are covered in the first three stages of awakening. And at that point, there persists only very subtle, refined forms of desire, aversion, and delusion, which are then what distinguishes a non-returner from an arhat. Okay.
And Sud asks, what are some of the benefits of Devanusati, and how should one go about doing this? How often is it usually recommended one to do this? Once a day, once a week?
There's a few suttas on Devanusati. Do you recall where they are exactly?
Yeah. Like the Mahanama Sutta is one. Every time the Buddha talks about Devanusati, he says the same thing, as far as I'm aware. So the instructions, he gives it in a few places, actually not very many. I think the Mahanama Sutta would be one. Usually when he's talking either to lay people or talking on upositas, but I believe it does come up also for monks. And so, okay, so how should one go about it, and what are some of the benefits? Well, the way that the Buddha describes going about it is that you recollect what the qualities the devas have that cause them to be reborn there. So you're recollecting what are the causal principles, what are the principles in their hearts which allow them to be reborn in such nice, pleasant, divine, heavenly places, surrounded by nice, heavenly people. And then you look inside your own heart and you see if you have those qualities. And so the way that he describes it is the qualities, if I remember correctly, if you also know, the qualities are saddha. Saddha means faith or confidence. So you recollect, like, for example, the devas who were reborn in the Chatu Maharajika devas, so the devas of the four great kings, those devas were reborn there because they had faith. And then you recollect and you see in your own heart, do you also have faith? And then, so it's faith, chaga. Chaga is generosity or letting go, as well as sutta, which is learning, and sila, which is virtue, and panya, which is wisdom. Those are the ones that I can recall right now. So
sounds right. Yeah,
so it's faith, generosity, virtue, learning, and wisdom. And you see, like, oh, the devas were reborn because of these things in their heart, and then they experience right now, they're experiencing these very pleasant experiences, these very pleasant realms of existence. And you see that you have those in your heart now. So it's almost like you are a deva, or you have like a garden which is going to grow into a deva inside. And so the reason that you would do that is because it's a condition, it's a meditation that's supposed to make you feel joy. Because it's like you're saying you're going to heaven. It's like going to heaven, and you don't need to believe it because it says it in a book. But you believe it because you look and you meditate in your own heart and you see that whatever conditions you would need in order to go to heaven, you have those right now. And then also it builds faith, I would say, it could build faith in the power of rebirth and also in the power of spiritual practice. Because one of the things is if you don't pay attention to your mind, for example, if you're caught up only in the sensory world and you're not actually looking inward at how the mind is operating within that, how it's reacting to that, most people are just not even aware that they're constantly maybe in a state of confusion or craving or aversion. And so because of that, they think, we usually think that happiness comes from getting things that we like. So it comes from the objects. But actually the cause of happiness is virtue. So just like the cause of suffering is actually craving, because craving is the ultimate root of it. So the ultimate root is actually craving. The suffering is just like a symptom. So in the same way, happiness ultimately, at least in the level of samsara, it comes from virtue. And so we don't recognize that if we don't focus on that. So we have to retrain our mind. We have to teach our mind, like, wow, when the mind has faith, generosity, learning, virtue, and wisdom, it can become very bright, it can become very joyful, it can become very self-confident, it can become more established and stable because it doesn't need to worry about the past or the future because you have everything you need right now. Your future is set, your past is covered, and your present is good. And so those are some of the reasons that you do it. And then also because of that, you see like, oh, the conditions that would lead to heaven, those actually have a powerful effect on the mind. So then you can infer from that through that experience that it does make sense on some level that there are actually devas. Like if you can just imagine, if someone really did have these qualities, it would make sense that their mind would go to a very nice, pure heavenly place. It wouldn't make sense for their mind to be reborn as an animal. So then it can give you faith in devas by having faith in your own qualities. And then how often is it usually recommended? Well, the Buddha did recommend it on Uposatha days. Like he recommended specifically for lay people that on Uposathas, they should set aside time, follow the 8 precepts, and they should practice meditation. And he really recommended these meditations because they're supposed to be joyful, they're supposed to be easeful, and they're supposed to be inspiring and powerful, uplifting. So this is one of them that he recommended, but obviously as much as possible, or as much as is helpful at least. Maybe if you do it too much, it would not be helpful. You also want to have other ways to stabilize the mind. But this is one tool that, especially at least on the Uposatthas, the Buddha recommended doing these kinds of uplifting recollections. And keeping in mind that he was also teaching that to lay people who probably were busy. Like you shouldn't cap yourself at that. So if you can do it once a day, that would be awesome. That'd be great.
Okay. Next one.
Okay, so it says, what role do you think imagination plays in meditation? Or is it just more delusion? For example, if someone is yelling at us, then let's say imagining the other person is similar to someone who's trying to paint in the air or trying to write on water, and imagining our loving kindness as water or air, which is not affected and thereby non-reacting. Or is this only creating more delusion in the mind?
Well, again, the important thing is results. If you're doing that kind of imagination process and the result is that it helps you to practice equanimity and patience and loving kindness, then that's good. As long as you recognize that it's just, the imagination is just a tool that you're using, then again, it's the results that matter. So if it helps, then it's fine.
You can also use it for Devanusti.
Yeah.
Mention the Devas. Okay. Oh, we already read these.
Yeah.
Okay, and then Joseph says, I have a question. He has a question about the Brahmaloka. If beings there are immeasurably radiating the 4 immeasurables, aren't they making abundant merits for eons? It's hard to see how one will fall after that.
Well, the way I think of this actually is that the beings in the Brahma Loka, they are experiencing the results of having cultivated a heart radiant with loving kindness and the other qualities. That doesn't necessarily mean they're currently actively doing it. So I think of, for example, riding a bicycle. There's a period of time where you're pedaling and you're putting a lot of energy into pedaling, but then you can stop pedaling and just relax, and the bicycle will continue coasting for quite some time. So there's still movement happening even though you're not currently actively putting any effort in. The movement is the residual momentum of the activity you had done in the past. So that's more how I think about it, is that the Brahma Devas had spent a lot of time cultivating this brightness of heart. So building up this brightness of heart, this radiant, glowing heart. And then they're born in the Brahma Loka, and they have this radiant, glowing heart that's still giving off the radiance that they built up. And that will last for quite some time. But it will eventually fade and go out if they don't continue maintaining it, if they don't continue adding to that radiance. So yeah, not necessarily is every Brahma Deva still cultivating Brahma Viharas. They're not necessarily still practicing metta and so on. They might just be experiencing the residual momentum of having cultivated it a lot in the past. In fact, there's a few suttas of the Buddha interacting with Brahma Devas who were not particularly inspiring or impressive. They were actually pretty self-centered and delusional. So rather than cultivating the karma that would make them continue to be Brahma Devas, they were actually cultivating the karma that would lead to them falling. Okay.
And Mike says, I've recently set up a Buddha altar in my room and have been doing morning and evening pujas. Sadhu. Outside of incense and practice, are there other forms of offerings I can give, and how do I deal with them?
I mean, there's a lot of traditions in Buddhism. The most basic and common is offering candles, flowers, and incense, bowing and chanting and doing meditation. That's all pretty standard. Offering of food is also quite common. So making a little tray of food and drinks and offering it before the Buddha. So again, cultivating that heart of if the Buddha was alive and was in front of you, and you wanted to offer food and drink to the Buddha, doing it with that kind of reverence and respect and the genuine wish to make offerings to a fully awakened being. That's also a very common practice in Buddhist traditions. But the important thing is doing what your heart really feels called to. Doing forms of offering and of puja, veneration, which help you to cultivate that sense of reverence and respect for the Buddha. Okay.
Yeah. So Lily says, sorry if I have too many questions. In order to become a stream enterer, how can we discern between good rituals and bad rituals that fall under Sila Bhatta Paramasa? Thank you.
Well, first off, don't be embarrassed about having a lot of questions, because if there were no questions, then there would be no monk chat. So Lily, it's people like you who make monk chat possible. Otherwise, we would just sit here quietly for about 30 seconds and then turn off the live stream, which so far I don't think it's ever happened.
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's come close a couple of times.
Yeah.
As for your question, it's not necessarily that there's good rituals and bad rituals. Sila Bhatta Paramasa is not about the activities themselves, but rather about our relationship with the activities. So Sila Bhatta Paramasa means a wrong grasp or misappropriation or misunderstanding of religious practices. So for example, in the example earlier where we were talking about offering flowers and incense and food and drinks and doing bowing and chanting and so on, none of that has any innate power. All of it is futile. However, it creates an activity which reminds you to cultivate wholesome states of mind. That's the true practice. That's where the true power is. It's in the cultivation of wholesome mind states. So ceremonial and ritual forms, religious customs and so on, these are in and of themselves, they are hollow and meaningless, but they are a useful container for supporting the cultivation of wholesome mind states. So this is the distinction. So before stream entry, you might see somebody making offerings to a Buddha statue and bowing and chanting, and you might think, oh, that's Sila Bhatta Paramasa. And then after stream entry, you might see that same person still doing exactly the same rituals, making the same offerings, doing the same bowing, doing the same chanting. The difference is that a stream enterer understands that these ritual forms, these religious customs and practices are vessels for cultivating a wholesome mind. And it's the cultivation of the wholesome mind that is important. It's the cultivation of the wholesome mind that leads to awakening, not the activities themselves. So that's the difference. Sila Bhatta Paramasa is a misunderstanding of religious practices, whereas a stream enterer has a correct understanding of Sila Bhatta, a correct understanding of how to use religious practices in a way that supports the cultivation of the heart. Okay.
And then Mom says, to me, may I ask how many hours a day you dedicate towards memorization of the suttas? And is this a core practice for you? Has memorization always come easy for you? How would someone strengthen this specific skill? Well, I don't really dedicate hours to it. Sometimes, actually, maybe sometimes, certain days or certain moods and so on, I might spend time memorizing the suttas. It kind of depends on what I'm memorizing and how I'm feeling. So most days I would say I actually don't spend time memorizing the suttas. But there are periods where I spend more time. And is this a core practice for you? I would say, though, it is a core practice for me, the core practice in the sense of I consider it very nourishing to me, reading the suttas, but especially relating to them as memory. Because one of the things is, like, some people think, at least, that we don't need to memorize things because it's in books and things. But actually, whenever you're thinking of something, you have to memorize it. See, even if the book is in front of you, if you start thinking about it, you can't be reading and thinking at the same time. So whenever you're contemplating it, it means you've memorized it. And that means you've memorized it imperfectly if you haven't actually memorized it. So when people say we don't need to memorize because we have books, what they're actually saying is we can memorize imperfectly because we can just quickly look. But you can't actually contemplate when you're reading. And when you're not reading, you have to rely on your memory of what you just read. So actually, you always need memory whenever you're thinking about something. So no matter how quick it is from you reading it. So that's why it's important to memorize, because the Buddha taught things specifically, and the Buddhist tradition has put a lot of work to preparing it. So for me, I actually relate to it as, like, as you memorize something, then first you actually, like, for me at least, first when you memorize, you actually don't know much about it because you're learning it. But that's why you start with memory. And then as you start memorizing and you start repeating and reciting, then little things start reaching out, like little connections. So for example, I memorized the Parayana, and there's so many connections in there that I just never would have got if I didn't memorize it, repeat it over and over again. Like, so many little things and little details and little nuances, and, like, also in meditation or in contemplation, like the impact of certain phrases or certain questions or certain responses would really come out. Whereas, like, if you're just skimming through it, it's just like one line, you just be kind of glossed over or explained away. So I found it really helpful in that way. Also in directing the mind, like, basically my mind is basically constantly thinking about Dhamma. Like, I hardly think about other things. And it's just because I spend so much time thinking about it. Like, that's really what I spend most of my time thinking about all the time, and memorizing it. So memorizing it, reciting it, or thinking about it. So I found that very helpful, because it's like, for example, if the mind is restless or something, I can just recite the entire Mahanidana Sutta, and that could take, like, over an hour maybe. So it's like, you have something to do always. So if you're going to be thinking, well, at least might be reciting suttas. So I found that helpful. Has it always come easy? I wouldn't say always come easy, but I do think probably it comes easier for me. Not like, it's not personal. I think it's just, I assume so, because I do have a easier time memorizing it. But that doesn't mean that, I'm sure there's people who are much, much better at memorizing than I am. So maybe relatively to some people, but I wouldn't say it's like a super talent or anything. I do have to put work into it. But it gets easier over time. So how would you strengthen this specific skill? Is you just start memorizing. Like, I would recommend that if you pick something that you want to learn and start reciting it just plainly, and get a little bit familiar with it. Because if you memorize something that you haven't heard before, it'll be harder. But if you have a sense of the rhythm and how it goes, and some of the phrases, then you'll have a better sense. So just start reciting it, maybe at like a evening or morning chanting that you do in your own practice. Start reciting something, and then start memorizing it. And you can do that in however is most helpful for you. But I would recommend, but when you're memorizing verbatim text, you just have to kind of do it the brute force way. There are tricks, but I don't use them. And even if you do use tricks, you have to memorize the words at the end of the day. So just start memorizing what's helpful for you. And then what you do is you learn the right pace. So you start going not too slow, not too quick. So for example, I think when I started learning the Parayana, it took me quite a while. And then when I went to visit my parents, I memorized the last of it while I was there. because it just got easier. So as you start memorizing, it'll start picking up. You'll start to be able to learn more. But at the beginning, it might be slow, and you might have to forget. You might have to go over it. So in the beginning, I'd recommend really trying to develop the skill of just regularity of reciting and learning, not forcing too much, but pushing yourself. And then as you go, you'll start to pick up, okay, I can learn more, and I can do more, and I can do more. And then eventually, like if you want to learn something longer, it'll be easier because the mind gets used to memorizing. It just becomes kind of like a muscle that the mind can start exercising. And I also recommend picking things that are inspiring and that you learn the meaning of them. That way, when you memorize and when you recite, you really look forward to it. It's very meaningful and inspiring. So in that way, it makes it a lot easier. Versus if you're memorizing like what's it called? The Constitution or anything by Abraham Lincoln.
Phone book.
Yeah, the phone book.
Oh wait, phone books don't exist anymore. I forgot about that.
Yeah, if you're memorizing something that you don't really find inspiring, then it will be a little bit harder. But if you find it inspiring, then it's really good. And then you can also recollect, like for me, I sometimes will think that if you memorize one of the suttas, that actually probably the Buddhist disciples, maybe even the Buddha himself knew that, to something similar. So you're following in the footsteps of the tradition.
Okay, and we have many questions, so
okay,
can go through these a bit more quickly.
What is this world classified as? Hell, Brahman? I don't know what that. Oh,
that's classified as the human realm.
Oh, yeah.
That's what this world is. It's the human realm. It's somewhere in between the hell realm and the Brahma realm. So samsara as a whole is a perfectly balanced mixture of pleasure and pain. So on the extreme of pain, there's the hell realms, where it's just basically utter suffering all the time. Like you think being a human is bad, it's not. The hell realm is literally constant suffering all the time. And on the other extreme, we have the very high heaven realms, higher even than the Brahma realms, where it's just pure bliss. But all realms are temporary. And depending upon the karma that we make, the choices that we make, then we will experience different conditions in future lives, either more pleasant or less pleasant, more fortunate or less fortunate. The human realm is considered to be an even mixture of good and bad fortune, of pleasure and pain. So above, things get more pleasant. Below, things get more painful. The human realm is right in the middle. Okay.
Okay. And Hasanta says, Montes, I'm interested in your view about free will. Volitional intentions are critical, yet everything is conditioned. Please explain.
Well, there's a lot of debate around this particular issue. And ultimately, the answer is that it's both. So the current situation that we're experiencing is conditions created by past karma, choices we made in the past. But then with these conditions that we have, we make a choice. And that choice is called karma, and it then influences what we experience in the future. And this is important because during the time of the Buddha, there were many different views and opinions around karma and around choice and around free will and so on. There were many different opinions. And one of the beliefs at the time of the Buddha was the belief that your choices didn't matter, that choices were an illusion, actually, that there was no free will, and that if you just waited, if you just wait long enough, then eventually you'll just magically attain enlightenment automatically. But that choices is irrelevant because you're not actually making choices. And the Buddha rejected that view. He said that that view doesn't actually lead to awakening. It actually leads to inaction, to not doing what needs to be done. But that instead, one needs to deliberately cultivate the conditions which lead to awakening. So that means that there is some element of volition, some element of will, and yet it's also within the context of conditions. So for example, right now, you probably don't have wings because most humans don't have wings. So it would be, if you wanted to choose to start flying, well, that would be difficult because you don't have wings. Basically impossible. So as much as you might want to, you simply don't have the conditions to actually make that choice. So similarly, someone might be like, well, right now I choose to be fully enlightened. And it's like, well, it's a nice idea, but you don't have the supportive conditions. So most of Buddhist practice is about creating supportive conditions for awakening. Most of Buddhist practice is not actually about awakening. It's about creating the conditions that support awakening. So in this, there is both a sense of free will and also a sense of reliance upon conditions. But our conditions are created by our choices. So we make choices that create the conditions that support awakening in the future. Okay, next.
Okay. And Kelsar Friend says, should I prioritize Dhamma study or meditation, or should I do both equally?
You should do both. You should do both. Everyone I've met who focused exclusively on one or the other turned out badly. People who only do meditation and don't study the suttas, they just wind up practicing incorrectly. People who just study the suttas but don't actually meditate, well, they're missing the point, aren't they? They said it's like the spoon in the pot of soup. Even though it's immersed in the soup, it never tastes it, never knows the flavor of the soup. So that's somebody who just studies the Dhamma but doesn't actually apply it. So you need to do both. You need to both study the suttas and also practice them, which includes meditation as well as morality and so on. Okay, next.
And Lily says, how can we discern whether a person genuinely possesses loving kindness or is merely engaging in metta-like actions to accumulate personal merit and good karma? Is the motivation behind the latter approach something that can or should be questioned?
Well, Lily, what I recommend is don't judge others. Look at your own heart. And look at your own heart and just see, well, first of all, am I doing good things or bad things? Next, then you work on refining your conduct. So actually, somebody who's engaging in metta-like actions just out of a wish to accumulate merit and good karma, that still is, in fact, good karma. It's just even better karma if one is doing acts of kindness purely for the sake of doing acts of kindness. That's even better. And actually, the best is understanding that one is cultivating kindness because it's a factor of awakening. That's the best. So don't judge others. Just look at how to improve your own heart. Don't worry so much what others do or don't do. Okay.
Yeah, recently there was a program here, and someone said that they heard about someone who was giving gifts, and she asked the person, and she said, like, she gives all these gifts so that she can go to heaven.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May she be reborn in heaven as she wishes.
And she was appalled that we talked about the different levels of giving. Okay, so Mike says something about, I think it's related to this previous thing, but looks like it's not a question. Saying he understands what you're saying. He was trying to speak up.
Yeah, so keep going. We have a lot of questions below.
So
yeah.
Okay. And this one says, is Majjhima Nikaya and middle length Lamrim are the same?
Well, Lamrim is a Tibetan term which refers to gradual series of trainings and practices which are traditional in Tibetan Buddhism, and actually there's several different versions of it. But no, it's not the same as the Majjhima Nikaya. It's actually quite different.
Yeah. Not the same. Okay, Bill Stewart says, where is Bhante Mette go? Is he coming back to Empty Cloud?
He is currently in Thailand, staying, last I heard, he's still at Wat Makjan, which is Ajahn Anand's monastery, relatively large forest monastery, which has a fair number of international monks from different countries. And he really likes it there. So is he coming back to Empty Cloud? I don't know. I wouldn't expect it anytime soon because, again, he seems to be really enjoying Thailand. So May he continue to enjoy wherever he is. May all of us enjoy wherever we are, in fact.
Right
I
here.
enjoy where I am.
It's good.
Yeah.
Okay. Lily says, let's see, this question, yes. Is the necessary conditions for becoming a stream master? What is the major difference between Sakkaya Ditthi and Attavadupadana?
Well, I would say Sakkaya Ditthi is a specific manifestation of self-clinging. So Attavadupadana. Sakkaya Ditthi is a specific form of self-identity. But Attavadupadana is a bit more inclusive. So it's grasping at the idea of self, which would include also the more subtle layers of self-clinging and self-identity. So Sakkaya Ditthi is the more course-specific, detailed manifestation of it. So it's usually defined in the sutras as identifying as the body and mind. So thinking the body is me, or I am in the body, or the body is mine, or the body is in me. And then the same for the four mental khandhas. So thinking I am feeling, or feeling belongs to me, or I am in feeling, or feelings are in me. So the four forms of self-identity in relationship to each of the five khandhas. So that's Sakkaya Ditthi. It's a specific self-identity in relationship to the details of body and mind. Whereas Attavadupadana is a much broader and more inclusive term, which includes any aspect of grasping at or latching on to the concept of self, the concept of self-existence, or the concept of ongoing persistent soul or entity. Okay. Next one.
Everyone says, what is the most skillful way of assuring a monk how wonderful they are?
By telling them that you appreciate how they aid you in practicing the Dhamma. Tell them that when you follow their instructions and their example, then that gives you, it helps you progress in the Dhamma. So in the suttas, it says the best way to repay one's teacher is to follow the Buddha's instructions. So how do you, I'm paraphrasing a bit. Anyway, so
Memorize it.
that's the benefit of memorizing, isn't it?
I haven't memorized it either, so.
Yeah, neither have I, apparently. What's the most skillful way of assuring a monk how wonderful they are? By not telling them how wonderful they are, but by rather saying how wonderful the Dhamma is and how grateful it is that how grateful you are to have monks in your life who help you to see the Dhamma and practice the Dhamma. Because ultimately, I don't care whether or not people think I am wonderful, but I do care if people are practicing the Dhamma. So a good monk is not interested in praise. They actually don't care what other people's opinion of them is. But a good monk is delighted when other people say, oh, Bhante, what you said helped me understand the Dhamma. Or, oh, Aya, this has really been useful in my practice. That gives me more confidence. Like those, that's what I love to hear. Like if someone is just like, oh, Bhante, you're so great. I'm just like, But if they're like, oh, Bhante, now that you said that, now I understand how to practice a bit better, or this doctrinal point makes more sense to me, or I have even more faith in the Buddha now. It's like, sadhu. May all go well in your practice.
Okay, and then Sud, another question here. How can one recognize if one has reached Upachara Samadhi? Is there a specific way suttas or Buddhist scriptures describe this in meditation? Can one attain it with mantra meditation?
Well, so the suttas don't say anything at all about Upachara Samadhi because that's not a term that's found anywhere in the suttas. That's a commentarial term which first appeared 1,000 years later. So it's an interesting concept and it's a useful concept, but it's not one that's found in the suttas. So the suttas don't say anything about Upachara Samadhi because it's just not relevant. So the suttas say a lot about Samadhi in general. And the suttas also define jhana, which is samma samadhi, the culmination of correct samadhi practice is the 4 jhanas. But this concept of upachara samadhi was invented in the commentaries, and it actually appears to have been a consequence of the redefining of the 4 jhanas. So in the Visuddhimagga and in the commentarial tradition, based on the Visuddhimagga, the 4 jhanas were redefined to mean something somewhat different than what it means in the suttas. And in particular, they were redefined into an extremely specific and rarefied state of mind, which was quite challenging to enter and also is useless for cultivating insight, which is quite different from how it's described in the suttas, of course. So then the commentarial tradition then invented a new samadhi attainment, which they called upachara samadhi, which is supposed to be when you're close to jhana, but not actually entering jhana. And they were saying upachara samadhi is actually the best mind state for practicing insight, which is, of course, in flat contradiction to what the Buddha said. The Buddha said 4th jhana is the perfect condition for practicing insight. During 4th jhana is when you should be practicing insight. But that the Buddha's words on that and the commentarial tradition clashed. The commentarial tradition had redefined the jhanas as being mind states where it's impossible to practice insight. So they invented a new kind of samadhi, which they called upachara samadhi, which they said that's actually the ideal place to practice insight. So I recommend deleting the term upachara samadhi from your mind. It will do you no good. Again, if it's very carefully redefined, then it's actually a somewhat useful term. The problem is that it goes hand in hand with the apocryphal redefinition of jhana and the apocryphal tendency to contradict the Buddha's words. So I don't recommend going down that route. Just go with what it says in the suttas. So yeah, I'm not going to talk about upachara samadhi because it's not actually an early Buddhist concept and it's not found anywhere in the suttas. Okay.
Joe says, trying to deepen my understanding of renunciation and its opposite. Is it harmful to feed oneself? An arahant has to be an alms mendicant, but non-returners can still feed themselves and others. For context, trying to understand how to go out and get food either for myself and others without perception of sensual desire. Please remind me where the harm is to be mindful of.
Well, the contemplation on food, which we do every day at the monastery, the Buddha actually said we should do it whenever we're about to eat. Patisankha yoniso pindapatang patisevami, etc. It's reminding ourselves, why do we eat food? We eat food not for fun, not for pleasure, not for beauty, and so on. But instead, we eat food in order to nourish and sustain our body, to keep the body healthy, so not to cause harm to it, and to support our spiritual practice. That's why we eat. So renunciation doesn't mean that you stop eating. That's just foolishness. The Buddha tried that and concluded that it's not actually useful. But rather, it means relating to food as nourishment for your body and mind, relating to food as a support to your practice. So you should be looking at food and thinking, will this support my health or harm my health? Will this be good for my body or bad for my body? Will this support clarity of mind or reduce clarity of mind? That's how you should relate to food. Then the question of whether things taste good or not is just irrelevant. You'll be looking at things and classifying them in terms of health value and medicinal value and how it affects your spiritual practice. That's the proper way to relate to food. Okay.
Okay.
So then the renunciation there is that you're renouncing the craving for pleasure. So you see some processed chocolate cake and you're like, I want that, and yet I know that it would be harmful to my health and it would also produce brain fog, therefore harmful to my practice. And it would just be nurturing sensual desire and attachment, which is further harm to my practice. So I will practice renunciation by not eating the cake and instead eating healthy things.
Okay, and Gregor says, what meditation do you recommend as the core practice? Anapanasati?
Well, Gregor, it really depends upon the specific person because every person is a little bit different. So a practice which is really useful for one person may be less useful for somebody else. So I do think that for most people, mindfulness of the body is a really useful foundation. For most people, I recommend about 95% of your time should be doing mindfulness of the body. And mindfulness of breathing is one form of mindfulness of the body. So for most people, that's a really good basis. But the meditation training that I received in the Ajahn Chah system was to experiment, to constantly experiment with different styles of meditation, different ways of meditating, different methods or non-methods, different approaches, different attitudes, and constantly observe the results, constantly observe the effects. So constant experimentation, observation, and review as a way of starting to understand how different meditation methods affect your mind in different ways and start to understand when to use different methods and what methods are more useful for you and what methods are maybe for more specific or specialized circumstances. So that honestly is what I think is the right answer. The core practice I recommend is experimentation. Experiment with different methods and approaches. And sometimes what you learn is you learn what doesn't work. You spend 5 years doing things that don't work. Well, that's great. That means you learned a bunch of things that don't work. That's good. Cross those off the list and move on. Try out some other things. But yeah, for most people, mindfulness of the body is a really good basis. Okay.
Okay.
Ah, okay.
And Lily says that half of infinity is still infinity.
Confirmed. Okay, good. I am vindicated.
And Joe is rejoicing and practicing mindfulness of the body.
Sadhu.
Sadhu and the teachings. Sadhu, Joe. And then Sud says, Dear Bhante, do you think one can enter samadhi by practicing mantra meditation? Or should one just stick to the subjects mentioned by the Buddha, or did Buddha mention mantra meditation? Thank you.
Well, I don't think the Buddha specifically mentioned mantra meditation as we think of it these days. So things like repeating Om Ahung 100,000 times, like you won't find that anywhere in the suttas. But we do see mentioned in some places where the Buddha talks about, for example, in the Vitakka Santana Sutta, which is one of the classic suttas on this, where the Buddha gives 5 methods for regaining control of the mind, stabilizing the mind when it's engaged in useless or harmful thinking patterns. One of them is to turn the mind towards something wholesome instead. So to replace unwholesome thinking with wholesome thinking. And an example of that would be repetition of the qualities of the Buddha, or just repeating the name of the Buddha as a way of getting you to constantly think about the Buddha. So that's something which resembles mantra meditation and is an example of deliberately cultivating wholesome thinking. So actually just sitting there thinking about the Buddha. That's a way of practicing meditation. Or you might just repeat the Itipiso over and over in your mind. Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho. I'm getting happy just thinking about it. Oh, it's delightful. It's been a little while since I've done that. I remember I used to use that as a meditation technique sometimes. I just chant the Itipiso over and over in my mind. It's delightful.
Ajahn Reed led some meditations on that. So you could look those up soon and you could repeat it.
Yeah, so that's one method. Reciting the qualities of the Buddha, again, resembles a mantra. A bit on the long side, but some mantras are actually a bit on the long side. The practice of reciting the Buddha's name is actually meant to be an abbreviated form of that. So just reciting the name of the Buddha is a way of getting you to constantly think about the Buddha, rather than whatever random useless thinking you were doing before. In that list, there's also the one about turning your attention to something else. If you notice your mind is on something unwholesome, then you turn it away. So again, using a mantra as a way of turning the mind away from whatever unwholesome actions it's doing. And one of them he mentions using the strength of mind to crush the mind. And he gives the simile of like a strong person pushing down a weak person. So that's also mantra meditation is using this strong, powerful, forceful, repetitive mental activity to push all of the other activities out of the mind. So mantra meditation can actually fit into the Theravada scheme without too much effort. So can one enter samadhi by practicing mantra meditation? I would say it can really help with clearing away the hindrances. So in order to get into deep samadhi, you do eventually need to stop the mantra repetition, but it can definitely help you with clearing away the surface level hindrances so that you can enter shallow samadhi and then drop the mantra and let the samadhi deepen. Okay.
And Sud had a question. Should one focus on the space between the mantra just to stop up and to refresh the mind?
That's a good method. Yeah. I do often recommend that. So if you're using a mantra, then maybe in the beginning, you might be doing it rapid fire if your mind is really out of control. But then after a while, I recommend slowing it down and taking brief pauses between each repetition. And yes, in those brief pauses, inhabit that sense of silence and stillness.
Sadhu, Sud says thank you.
Okay.
And Jojo had a question here, but it's okay. So looks like the essence is, I was wondering if additional help and attention could be given virtually to me regarding having questions answered. I know there are weekly Q&As, but I would like to go more in depth when it comes to the precepts. Say in particular, I find myself pretty good with all the precepts except lying. Documentation, guidance on how to navigate this problem. And then they say they'd appreciate anyone who can hop on a call or calls when there's availability, and then said never mind the call. So I think maybe they're just wondering about getting more advice in particular life situations on this.
Yeah, I mean, Jojo would say just ask about specific things, and we'll do our best to answer. So ultimately, the precept on lying, it's about saying something which you know is false with the intention to deceive somebody else. That's what it is. And just ask yourself, is that what you're doing? Are you deliberately saying something that you know is false with the intention of deceiving somebody else? Then you know you're breaking the precept. Okay, and it looks like that's it. So thank you all for all your wonderful questions. We'll go ahead and conclude at this time. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And have a good night.